The first time Louisa Bristol rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, she set the water trough on fire, not literally, but close enough that 3 men dropped their whiskey glasses and one old preacher fell off his porch chair, and none of them could rightly explain afterward what it was exactly that had knocked the sense clean out of them. It was the way she moved, most likely. The way she sat her horse like the animal had been built specifically for her, like the saddle was a throne, and the Kansas wind was something she had personally arranged. Her hair was the deep, burning color of autumn maple leaves, thick and long and only half tamed by the braid she had thrown over one shoulder, and her eyes were so dark they looked almost amber when the afternoon sun caught them at the right angle, like embers just before they catch. She wore a cream-colored shirt tucked into riding trousers the color of storm clouds, and her boots were scuffed and cracked and clearly beloved, and she carried herself through the main street of Caldwell as though she had built every building on it with her own 2 hands and was mildly disappointed in the results. People talked about her before she even introduced herself. That was Louisa Bristol. That had always been Louisa Bristol. She had grown up 50 miles east in a small farming community called Benton Creek, the only child of a father who raised cattle and a mother who raised hell, and most folks said she had inherited equal parts of both. Her father, George Bristol, had taught her to ride before she could read, had put a rifle in her hands when she was old enough to hold one steady, and had spoken to her always like she was worth listening to, which had done something to her backbone that no amount of society manners could ever undo. Her mother, Clara, had taught her to read people the way you read weather, quick, accurate, and always with an eye toward what was coming next. Clara Bristol had died of fever when Louisa was 16. George Bristol had followed 2 years later, not from sickness but from grief, which everybody in Benton Creek understood even if they did not say it plainly. He had simply stopped eating with any real interest in continuing, and one January morning he had not woken up, and that had been that. Louisa had sold the farm. She had packed what she could into a single leather saddlebag and left Benton Creek at 18, and for the next 3 years she had worked wherever she could find work: ranch hand, fence mender, occasional cattle driver on smaller runs, once a cook for a survey crew that was mapping grassland in southern Kansas, a job she had quit inside of a week when the crew foreman made certain remarks she found unacceptable. She had knocked him off his stool with a single flat-handed shove, collected her week's pay, and ridden west. She was 21 when she arrived in Caldwell in the spring of 1879, and she was looking for steady work. And she carried with her a letter of reference from a rancher named Holt in Wichita who had employed her for 8 months as a general hand, and had written in his letter, in somewhat cramped handwriting, that she was the most capable person he had ever hired, regardless of any other consideration, and that whoever took her on would be getting the better end of the arrangement. The man who owned the largest operation near Caldwell was named Cecil Drummond. He ran about 400 head of longhorn cattle on a spread that stretched along the Chicaskia River for several miles, and he was perpetually understaffed because he paid poorly and had a temper that tended to scatter workers the way a storm scattered leaves. Louisa rode out to Drummond's ranch on her second morning in Caldwell and found him standing in his corral wrestling with a disposition problem in the form of a bay gelding that did not want to be saddled. She leaned on the fence rail and watched for a moment. "You are going about that wrong," she said. Cecil Drummond looked up. He was a broad, red-faced man in his late 40s with a mustache that had given up any pretense of being groomed. He stared at her. "I beg your pardon," he said, in a tone that did not contain any actual begging. "The horse," Louisa said. "He is bracing because you are coming at him from the left too fast. He is telling you he has something wrong with his left side. Let me show you." Drummond opened his mouth to say something dismissive, but Louisa had already swung off the fence and walked into the corral with the calm certainty of someone who had been invited. She approached the gelding from the right, let him smell her hand, ran her palm along his neck speaking low and steady, and within 3 minutes had him saddled and standing quiet. Drummond hired her on the spot, though he would never admit the corral scene had anything to do with it. That was how Louisa came to be a permanent fixture on the Drummond spread for the next year and a half, which was how the reputation fully solidified. The other hand, 6 of them, all men, ranging from a quiet 18-year-old named Tommy who had run away from somewhere in Missouri to a weathered old rope hand named Cutter who had worked cattle since before the war, received her with varying degrees of suspicion and acceptance, and she dealt with all of them the same way she dealt with most problems. Straight on, with no wasted energy on either offense or apology. Inside of 2 weeks, Tommy followed her around like a duckling. Cutter, who had seen more than most people ever would, watched her one afternoon spend 2 hours in the blazing Kansas sun, coaxing a calf out of a mud bank, never losing her patience or her focus, and he told her that evening over supper that she was the most stubborn creature he had encountered in 60 years, and he meant it as the highest possible compliment. By the time Bernard Rhodes arrived in Caldwell in the fall of 1880, the name Louisa Bristol had been circulating in the town and the surrounding ranch country for long enough that it had taken on a particular quality. People said it in the way people said the names of weather events. They said it with a kind of respectful caution, the way you might mention a flash storm or a prairie fire, acknowledging that it was something real and significant and not to be underestimated, even if your experience of it had been perfectly fine. She is called a wildfire by everyone who knows her, a man at the Caldwell saloon told Bernard on his first evening in town, and Bernard, who had just arrived from Denver by way of several months of hard traveling, set down his glass and said, "Is that right?" It was not a question. It was the kind of statement a man makes when something he has just heard has landed somewhere interesting inside of him, and he wants a moment to let it settle. Bernard Rhodes was 27 years old. He was from Virginia originally, born in 1853 to a family that had farmed tobacco for generations, and the war had come through when he was a boy and rearranged everything. The farm, the family, the particular shape of the future he had been raised to expect. His father had survived the war but returned from it quieter and more breakable, and had died of a lung ailment when Bernard was 15. His mother had held the family together through will and considerable practical intelligence, until Bernard's 2 younger brothers were old enough to work. And then Bernard had moved west, following the general direction that the railroad and the cattle trade and the promise of open land were pulling a whole generation of young men. He had spent 3 years in Colorado, working in mining operations near Denver, not underground, which he had tried once and quickly determined was not a state of being he could sustain, but in the supply and organizational side of things, driving wagons, managing equipment, learning the particular math of moving heavy things across difficult terrain. He was good with numbers, good with logistics, good with the kind of quiet problem-solving that kept large operations from coming apart at the seams. He was also good with horses, which was less of a practical skill and more of a genuine affection. He loved them with the earnest, uncomplicated love of someone who had grown up around them and found them reliably more sensible than most people. He had come to Caldwell because he had heard from a man in Denver that there was range land available along the Kaskaskia for anyone who had the patience and the capital to start small and build. And Bernard had saved with the kind of disciplined purpose that comes from knowing exactly what you want and being willing to wait for it. He wanted land. He wanted cattle. He wanted something permanent that he had built with his own decisions and his own hands, something that could not be rearranged by war or circumstance or someone else's choices. He had enough saved to put down on a modest piece of land and buy a small starting herd, and he had arrived in Caldwell with a specific plan and the general intention of being sensible and methodical about all of it. He had not factored in Louisa Bristol. To be fair, No one had ever successfully factored in Louisa Bristol. He met her on his third morning in Caldwell, which was a Saturday in early October 1880. He had ridden out to have a look at a piece of land for sale near the Drummond Spread, and had arrived at the boundary fence to find someone already there, crouched in the grass, examining the quality of the soil with her fingers in that focused, professional way that told him immediately she knew what she was doing. She looked up when she heard his horse. The morning light was coming from the east, hitting her sidelong, and he thought with the involuntary clarity of a thought that arrives before you have time to be sensible about it, that he had never seen anyone look quite so much like they belonged to the landscape they were standing in. She was part of the grass and the wide sky and the early fall light, and she was also entirely, completely herself, looking at him with dark amber eyes that were assessing him with the frank directness of someone who had no time for politeness if honesty would serve better. "You are looking at the Harker land," she said. "Not a question either." "I am," he said. "Soil is good along the eastern edge where you could run a creek channel. The western section floods in spring unless you put in drainage, which would cost you before you have anything coming in." She stood up, brushing the dirt from her fingers on her riding trousers. "The price Harker is asking is fair if you know about the western section. If you do not know and pay full price anyway, you will have paid too much." Bernard looked at her for a moment. "That is a generous amount of information to offer a stranger." "It is practical," she said. "I work the Drummond Spread next over. If someone buys the Harker land and does not know what they are doing, they become my problem too, eventually. I am just saving myself future inconvenience." He almost smiled at that. "Bernard Rhodes," he said, holding out his hand. She shook it. Her grip was firm and direct like everything else about her. "Louisa Bristol, I have heard of you," he said. Something flickered in her eyes, not vanity, not irritation, something more complicated. "I imagine you have," she said. "They say you are called a Wildfire," he said. She tilted her head, waiting to see what he would do with that. "I said to the man who told me," Bernard continued, in the same calm, unhurried tone he seemed to carry naturally, "that I had always wanted to sit close to that kind of heat." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. The Kansas wind moved through the grass around them, and a hawk turned somewhere overhead, and Louisa Bristol looked at Bernard Rhodes for a long, unguarded moment in which something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, not the way it would in a story that was being too obvious about itself, but genuinely in the way a person shifts when they encounter something they did not expect. "That," she said finally, "is either the boldest thing a stranger has ever said to me, or the most interesting." "Could be both," he said. She studied him another moment, this man with his steady dark eyes and his quiet, unhurried way of existing in the world, this man who had just said something that nobody in 3 years of encountering Louisa Bristol had ever said, and she thought, "Well, that is something." "Buy the land," she said, "but negotiate on the western section." And she rode back toward the Drummond Spread, and Bernard Rhodes stood in the October morning looking after her, and thought that he had made a very good decision coming to Caldwell. He bought the Harker land 10 days later, after negotiating with Old Man Harker in a 2-hour conversation that ended with Harker begrudgingly admitting that the flood issue on the western section was in fact a known quantity, and dropping the price by 12%, which Bernard found satisfactory. He took possession of 50 acres of reasonably good Kansas grassland with a small 2-room cabin on it that had seen better years but was structurally sound, and he went to work. His nearest neighbor to the east was the Drummond Spread, which meant that over the course of October and into November, he saw Louisa Bristol with a regularity that he found himself structuring his days around in a way that he chose, for the time being, not to examine too closely. She would be riding the fence line, or cutting across the open country between the properties, or occasionally sitting at the boundary on her blue roan horse. A beautiful animal she had named Creek, for reasons that seemed personal, watching the same stretch of sky that he was watching from his side. The first time he rode out to meet her at the fence was a Wednesday afternoon in late October, when the sky had gone that particular dense gold that happened in Kansas in the fall, everything saturated and heavy with the season. He brought 2 cups of coffee in a tin pot because he had been making it anyway, and it seemed sensible, and he offered her one through the fence, and she took it with a look that said she was deciding whether to be amused. "You just happened to be bringing coffee to the fence line," she said. "I was taking a ride," he said. "I had made extra." "You made extra coffee and then rode it out to the boundary fence." It seemed wasteful to pour it out. She drank the coffee and did not say anything else about it, but the corner of her mouth moved in a way that settled something warm and certain in his chest. They talked that afternoon about the land, the cattle market, the quality of the Caldwell water, the coming winter. It was practical conversation, the kind that 2 people who work the land have naturally, grounded in the specific and the real. But underneath it, and both of them could feel this without mentioning it, like feeling heat from a fire you are not yet looking at, there was something else running. A current. An attention that was more than neighborly, more than professional, more than the polite interest of 2 people who happened to share a fence line. He asked her about herself. She answered carefully at first, the way someone does when they are not accustomed to being asked, giving him the facts without the interior of them. He listened in the particular way he had, which was complete and patient, and entirely without the tendency that most people had to jump in with their own experience as soon as they recognized a connection. She found herself telling him about her parents. She had not talked about her parents to anyone in a long time. She talked about her father teaching her to ride, her mother's dark humor and her sharp, clear-eyed way of seeing the world, the years in Benton Creek, the farm, the fever that took her mother, the grief that took her father. She talked about packing the saddlebag and riding out at 18 with nowhere specific to go, and the years of work and moving, and how she had found something like home in the particular quality of the work itself, in doing something with her body and her mind that was necessary and real, in being useful in a way that could be measured and felt. Bernard listened. He said when she was finished, "You have been building something a long time, just not in one place." She looked at him. "Yes," she said quietly, like he had named something she had been carrying without a name. He told her his own version, then Virginia, the war coming through like a door slammed open in the middle of a quiet life, his father returning changed, his father dying, his mother's stubborn, determined survival, the years in Colorado, the savings, the plan. "You are a man with a plan," she said, not mockingly, just observing. "I am a man with a plan," he agreed. "It does not always survive contact with actual events. Plans rarely do," she said. "That is why you need to be able to adjust the plan," he said. "Not abandon it, just adjust." She was quiet for a moment, looking out across the gold-lit grass. "I have never had much of a plan," she said. "I have had instinct and direction, but not a plan." "Instinct and direction got you here," he said. "That is not nothing." She looked at him again, and this time the look was different, softer at the edges, though she would not have called it that, was in fact somewhat alarmed to realize it was happening at all. She finished her coffee and handed the cup back through the fence. "Thank you for the coffee," she said. "Any time," he said. She rode back toward the Drummond spread, and he stood at the fence long after she was gone, watching the place on the horizon where she had disappeared. October gave way to November, and November grew cold and sharp, and the Kansas wind acquired teeth. Bernard was busy getting the cabin in proper order for winter, fixing the drafts, shoring up the fireplace, cutting and stacking enough wood to see him through. And Louisa was busy with the particular intensity of a ranch operation battening down before winter weather, and they saw each other with less frequency. But the fence line meetings, when they happened, took on a weight that compensated for the scarcity. He brought coffee regularly. Sometimes she brought it from her side. Once she brought cornbread wrapped in cloth, still warm, and he ate it standing in the cold wind, and it was the best cornbread he had ever tasted. He told her so, and she said she would not have put that particular memory in any brag book, cornbread being hardly a skill, and he said he disagreed, that a thing done well was a thing done well regardless of what it was. "You argue like someone who has had to defend small things," she said. "I grew up with two younger brothers," he said. "I have had to defend my share of the bread very literally." She laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and it undid something in him that he had not known was wound up tight. In December, a cold snap came down from the north that was severe enough to be genuinely concerning. The temperature dropped hard and fast over 3 days, and Bernard's small herd, he had bought 8 head to start, not enough to be vulnerable, but enough to matter, needed watching. He had been out through most of the night, and into the second day, when Louisa rode over the fence line on Creek, trailing a second horse loaded with hay she had brought from the Drummond stores. He came out of the barn to find her unloading it in the yard. "Drummond does not know I took this," she said without preamble, not exactly proudly but not apologetically either. "I will replace it from my wages and square it with him. Your animals needed it." He stood in the frozen yard looking at her, her breath misting in the brittle cold, her face red from the wind, the hay scattered around her feet, and he felt something so large and so completely clear that it was almost frightening in its simplicity. "Louisa," he said. She looked up from the unloading. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know I did not have to do it," she said. "Why did you?" She held his gaze, and she was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was deciding whether to say the real thing or the practical thing. "Because it needed doing," she said. Then, after a brief pause, "and because they are your animals." He took a step forward. In the frozen December morning, with the cattle shifting in the barn behind him and the blue sky overhead like something brittle and perfect, he took one step toward her and he said, "I think you should know that I have been thinking about you quite a lot." She set down the bundle she was holding. "I am aware of that," she said. "You are aware of it." "I have been thinking about you quite a lot as well," she said. "Which I find annoying, since I am not generally in the habit of thinking about people." He almost smiled. He came the rest of the way across the yard and stopped just in front of her, close enough that he could see the cold, bright amber of her eyes, and he said, "I do not want to be annoying to you." "It is too late for that," she said. "You already are. It is just that the annoyance and something else have gotten entirely mixed up together in a way I cannot seem to separate them." "What is the something else?" he asked, though he thought he knew. She looked at him for a long moment, this woman who had never been anything but fully herself, who had never softened an edge or rounded a corner for anyone. And she said, clearly and directly, the way she said everything, "I think I like you a great deal, Bernard Rhodes. More than I intended to when I started explaining soil quality to a stranger at a fence line." He reached out and put his hand along the cold curve of her jaw, and she let him, and she tilted her face up toward him, and he leaned down and kissed her in the frozen December yard, careful and certain, with the full intention that it represented. And she kissed him back with the same fullness, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of his coat, pulling him closer in a gesture that was so characteristically Louisa that it made his heart ache with something like joy. When they broke apart, the cold air rushed back between them and they both stood there for a moment in it. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She picked up the bundle of hay she had set down. "Let us get these animals sorted before this cold takes them," she said. They worked together in the barn for the rest of the morning, and it was the most natural thing either of them had felt in a very long time. Cecil Drummond was not immediately pleased when Louisa told him she had borrowed the hay from his stores. He was even less pleased, though he would not say so directly because he was not that kind of man, when he understood that the reason she had borrowed it was for the neighbor's herd, and the reason she cared about the neighbor's herd was something he could see clearly enough in the particular way she said Bernard Rhodes's name. Drummond was a difficult man, but not an entirely blind one. He docked the hay from her wages. She had expected that and accepted it without complaint. What she had not entirely expected was how quickly the change in the situation between herself and Bernard would become visible to the people around her. The other hands on the Drummond spread noticed within a week. Cutter pulled her aside one afternoon by the water pump and said, without any particular ceremony, "The new man next door." "What about him?" she said. "You ride the fence line more than the work requires," Cutter said. "The fence needs checking," she said. Cutter made a sound. "I have been doing this work for 40 years, he said. "You are happy. It is unusual on you and I am glad of it is all I wanted to say." Louisa looked at him for a moment. Cutter, 60 years old and worn like good leather, who had seen things she could not imagine and carried them quietly and never made much of any of it. She felt a sudden rush of affection for him that she would not have been comfortable expressing directly. "Thank you," she said simply. "Do not thank me," he said. "Just do not let it make you foolish. You are too useful to be foolish." "I will try to remain useful," she said. Tommy, the 18-year-old, was less subtle about his observations. He asked her directly one evening whether she was courting the new man on the Harker land, and she told him that was not his business, and he said that it was obvious from the look on her face, and he was glad for her. And she told him he had better go check the east fence before she found him something more time-consuming to do, and he went, grinning all the way. Bernard and Louisa did not rush. That was perhaps the thing that surprised both of them. They were not people who did things slowly, either of them, but this they did slowly, with a care that felt instinctive and right. They had Sunday afternoons when his work permitted, meeting at the fence line or riding out together across the open country, talking as they always talked, about everything, about nothing specific, about the shape of their lives and the quality of things and the particular way the Kansas sky looked at different times of day, which they both found inexhaustible as a subject. He took her to supper at the Caldwell Hotel dining room one January evening, and she wore the one good dress she owned, dark blue, practical in its cut, but good fabric, and sat across from him in the lamplight and ate roast beef and talked about cattle prices, and he thought she was the most beautiful person he had ever seen, and he had to work to keep that thought from getting onto his face in a way that would embarrass them both. She noticed it anyway. She noticed it, and she felt it like warmth. She told him about the men who had dismissed her over the years, the ranchers who had read her letter of reference and then looked at her, and offered her cook positions or laundry work instead of the ranch hand work she was clearly qualified for. The survey crew foreman she had shoved off his stool. She told it plainly. Without anger, the anger had been there once, she said, but she had found that anger consumed energy she needed for other things, so she had converted it into a kind of focused refusal. She would simply keep demonstrating her value until demonstrating it was unnecessary, and she would not wait for anyone's permission to take up the space she had earned. "That refusal," Bernard said, "is what people mean when they call you a wildfire." She considered this. "Probably," she said. "It is accurate," he said. "Fire does not ask permission to burn." She looked at him across the lamplit table. "Most people who call me that," she said slowly, "mean it as a warning." "I know," he said. "I mean it as an observation. There is a difference." She put her hand on the table between them, palm up, an offering that was also a question. He laid his hand over hers. They did not talk much after that, just sat in the warm restaurant with the winter dark outside the windows and the sound of other diners around them, and it was entirely comfortable, entirely sufficient, entirely what it was. February brought a stretch of warmer days that fooled nobody who had spent time in Kansas into thinking winter was finished, but it offered the particular relief of temporary reprieve. And on one of those days, a Saturday, when Drummond had given the hands a rare free afternoon, Louisa rode over to Bernard's cabin properly for the first time. He had been expecting her. He had cleaned the cabin with unusual thoroughness and had made enough food for two, which he thought was a reasonable kind of optimism, and he met her in the yard when she rode up and took Creek's reins, and she swung down with the fluid ease she always did everything. She stood in his yard and looked at his cabin, at the improvements he had made, the neat split-rail fence he had been building along the front, the repaired porch, the new shingles on the east side of the roof, and she walked up to the porch and put her hand on the post and looked out at the land. "You are building something real here," she said. "That is the intention," he said. "It is good land," she said. "You chose well. I had good advice on the soil quality," he said. She turned and looked at him, and there was something in her face that was softer than her usual register, not weak, never weak, but open like a door left ajar. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "I have been on my own for 3 years," she said. "Completely on my own, which I have not minded. I have been fine with it, better than fine. But lately, I have been noticing the way things look different when you are there to see them with." He was quiet, listening. "The sky looks different," she said, which was not the kind of thing she said, and they both knew it, and the vulnerability of it was completely clear between them. "I am telling you this because I am not a person who waits around for other people to say things first. If I am feeling something, I would rather say it and know where I stand than not say it and wonder. That is one of the things I find most compelling about you," he said. "That I talk too directly. That you are brave enough to be honest," he said. "Most people are not." She held his gaze. "I am falling in love with you," she said. "I thought you should know that." The February wind moved between them, carrying the smell of cold grass and distant water, and Bernard Rhodes looked at Louisa Bristol in the flat, clear winter light, and felt something settle into place inside him with the specific finality of something that has been waiting a long time to arrive. "I fell in love with you," he said, "at the fence line in October when you told me about soil quality, with the absolute conviction of someone who loves the thing they are talking about." She blinked. "That was the first day we met." "Yes," he said, a long pause. "You are saying you were in love with me from the first day." "I am saying something started then that has only become more certain since," he said. "Is that so strange?" She thought about it, and something crossed her face that was very nearly wonder, which was an expression she wore rarely enough that it made him catch his breath. "No," she said quietly. "I suppose it is not." He reached for her hand and she gave it. They ate supper in his cabin that evening, the stew he had made, with biscuits that were decent though not as good as her cornbread, a fact she did not hesitate to mention. And they talked until the fire burned low, sitting close to the warmth in the small front room, her feet tucked up beside her on the chair, his elbow on the table, and the easy intimacy of it felt like something they had been doing for years. She rode back to the Drummond spread in the dark, and he stood on his porch and watched the light of her lantern disappear across the country, and the sight of her going felt different now than it used to, because now he knew she was coming back. March arrived with mud and new grass and the particular busy energy of spring on working land, and Bernard was deep into the planning stages of what would be his first full season. He had acquired 14 head now, a small but serious number, and was working the land, mending fence, scouting water, building the kind of small daily structure that a ranch requires. Louisa continued at Drummond's, but she was also spending her free time helping Bernard with various aspects of the building work, not because he had asked, but because she could see what needed doing and had skills that were useful, and she was not in the habit of standing back from useful work. They fell into a rhythm together. It was the rhythm of two people who are genuinely well matched, who have different strengths that complement rather than compete, who can work side by side in comfortable silence and talk in comfortable fullness, and know the difference between when to offer help and when to leave someone to their own figuring. They did not agree on everything. Louisa had opinions about cattle management that differed from Bernard's on certain points, and they argued those points with the full energy of two people who were serious about the topic, and also, underneath the argument, enjoying each other enormously. She was right more often than not, and he was honest enough to say so when she was, and she was honest enough to say so when he was, which made the arguments both productive and oddly pleasurable. The other element of their growing life together was the town itself. Caldwell in 1880 and into 1881 was a cattle town in full operation, a loading point on the Kishom Trail where longhorns came up from Texas and were shipped east on the railroad, And with that trade came all the associated life of a genuine Western town. The main street had a hotel, a general store, a barber shop, a doctor's office run by a methodical man named Dr. Ellison, two churches that disagreed about several things but coexisted with surface civility, and the saloon that Bernard had first arrived in, run by a woman named Grace Haverson, who had the organizational intelligence of a military commander and the social instincts of a diplomat. Louisa was known by virtually everyone in Caldwell by this point, and Bernard quickly became known as well first as the new man on the Harker land, then, with a speed that reflected the efficiency of small-town information networks, as the man who was keeping company with Louisa Bristol. This latter fact prompted a variety of reactions, most of them benevolent, some of them curious, a few from older men who had wanted Louisa's attention themselves, amounting to a mild sourness that nobody took too seriously. What Caldwell thought, generally, was that the match was appropriate: two people of genuine quality, both capable, both serious, both with the kind of self-sufficiency that made people interesting rather than dependent. Grace Haverson said to the woman who ran the millinery shop that it was about time someone came along who could meet Louisa Bristol at her own level, which was the most romantic thing Grace had said about anyone in years. In May, something happened that brought several things into clarity at once. A man rode into Caldwell claiming a debt that Louisa supposedly owed him. His name was Arch Fenwick, and he was from her survey crew days, the foreman she had shoved off his stool in 1877. He had found his way to Caldwell by some combination of inquiry and bad luck, and he arrived angry and loud, and making claims in the saloon about Louisa Bristol's character that were both false and the kind of thing that could damage a reputation in a small town if left unchallenged. Louisa heard about it within an hour, as she heard about most things in Caldwell, because that was the nature of small communities. She rode into town on Creek and walked into the saloon and found Fenwick there, a hard-faced man in his 40s with a grudge he had been carrying for 3 years and nowhere else to put it. She stood in the saloon doorway and said, clearly enough for everyone present to hear, "Arch Fenwick, the debt you are claiming does not exist, as any honest account of what happened in 1877 would demonstrate, and I believe you know that." Fenwick stared at her. "You put your hands on me," he said. "You made remarks that warranted it," she said, "in front of your entire crew. 3 of those men are still alive and would likely remember what was said." The saloon was entirely quiet. Fenwick's face went several colors. "What I find interesting," Louisa continued, coming further into the room, her voice even and her eyes steady, "is that you have ridden 3 years' worth of distance to complain about a shove, when what you are actually upset about is that a woman refused to let you speak to her that way. That is the real debt you are trying to collect on, and I am afraid that one is not payable." Fenwick stood up from the bar. He was a large man, and he let his size be felt in the movement. Bernard Rhodes walked through the saloon door at that moment. He had been in town for supplies and had heard the situation from 2 different people in the time it took him to cross the street. He came in quietly and stood a few feet from Louisa's shoulder, not in front of her, not between her and Fenwick, but beside her, where it was clear he was present and where it was also clear that the scene was hers to manage. She did not look at him. She did not need to. She could feel him there. "I suggest," Bernard said to Fenwick, with the kind of quiet that is more significant than volume, "that you settle your account at the bar and ride on." Fenwick looked at Bernard. He looked at Louisa. He looked at the room full of people who were all watching him with the particular quality of attention that told him exactly how this calculus worked out. He left. He paid his bar tab and rode out of Caldwell before noon and did not return. In the saloon's aftermath, Grace Haverson poured Louisa a glass of water without being asked and said only, "Well handled," which from Grace was equivalent to an extended standing ovation. Outside, on the boardwalk, Louisa turned to Bernard. She looked at him for a moment, at the fact of him having walked in and stood beside her without getting in front of her, at the specific intelligence of that choice. "You stood next to me," she said. "Where else would I stand?" he said. She put her hand on the side of his face the way he had once put his hand on hers in the cold December yard, and she said, "I need you to know that I am aware of what that means, what you just did. I need you to know that I do not take it lightly." "I know you do not," he said. "Good," she said. She lowered her hand. "Now I am going to buy you a piece of pie from the hotel because that seemed like the appropriate response to this entire morning." He laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, surprised out of him, and she smiled at the sound of it in the way that people smile when something pleases them down to the bone. They ate pie in the hotel dining room and talked about nothing serious for an hour, and then rode back to their separate properties. And that evening, when she was at her bunk in the hands' quarters, she lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and thought with the clear, steady certainty of something that had been quietly building for months that she wanted to be with Bernard Rhodes. Not just in the way they currently were, properly with him, permanently. She wanted to wake up in the mornings with him there. She wanted to build the thing he was building, alongside him, together. She wanted the plan he had always had for something permanent and real to be her plan too. She was not afraid of the wanting. Fear had never been something she gave much house room to, but she recognized that this was significant, and she let herself sit with the significance of it for the full length of the evening before she went asleep. Bernard proposed to her in June 1881. He had been thinking about it since February, which was when he had known without any remaining uncertainty that this was the direction he had been moving without being fully conscious of it. He did not do it elaborately, neither of them were elaborate people, but he did it with intention and care, which were the things that mattered. It was an evening in early June, and they had ridden out together to the far eastern edge of his land, where the creek came close to the surface, and the grass was thick, and the June sky above them was going through its complicated sunset performance layers of gold and pink and deepening blue, the kind that made the whole Kansas landscape look like it was on fire from the inside. They had dismounted and were sitting in the grass watching the sky, close enough to feel the warmth of each other without touching, and Bernard said, "Louisa." She said, "I want to ask you something." She turned to look at him. He turned to look at her, and he said it plainly, "I would like to marry you. I would like you to say yes. Not because I think I need to have you, but because I think we would build something together that neither of us could build alone. And because when I think about the next 30 or 40 years of my life, you are in all of it, and I would rather make that official than spend those years in something vague." She looked at him for a long moment. The sunset was going on above them with its usual disregard for dramatic timing, pouring its gold and pink across the whole sky. "That is the least romantic proposal I have ever heard," she said, "which is exactly what makes it the most perfect thing anyone has ever said to me." "Is that a yes?" he said. "Yes," she said. "That is very much a yes." He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring, a simple thing, a gold band with a small dark stone, garnet, modest and exactly right, and she held out her hand and he put it on her finger, and she looked at it in the last light of the June evening. "Where did you get this?" she said. "I bought it in Caldwell," he said. "From the jeweler on 2nd Street. I described what I thought you would want and we worked from there." She looked at the ring on her hand and then at him. "You described what you thought I would want," she said softly. "I know you fairly well by now," he said. She reached out and took his face in both her hands and kissed him with the full warmth of everything she felt, and he put his arms around her and held her close in the June evening grass, and it was as good and as right as anything had ever been in either of their lives. They married in September 1881. The ceremony was at the smaller of Caldwell's two churches, conducted by the pastor, a mild and reasonable man named Reverend Galt, who had been quietly rooting for this development for months. The wedding was attended by virtually everyone Louisa knew. From the Drummond spread, Cutter stood up at the front with a look on his weathered face that was very nearly sentimental, and Tommy wore a jacket that was slightly too large for him, and polished his boots for what appeared to be the first time in recent memory. Cecil Drummond came as well, standing in the back in his best coat, which still had a button missing, and when Louisa caught his eye during the ceremony, he gave her the kind of firm, brief nod that was his version of warm regard. Grace Haverson attended in a remarkable hat. Dr. Ellison attended with his wife. Half the town of Caldwell attended, because Louisa Bristol was the kind of person whose wedding half the town felt entitled to attend, and nobody was turned away. Bernard's family could not be there. The travel from Virginia was not feasible, and his mother and brothers sent letters that arrived a week before the ceremony, warm and congratulatory. His mother's letter full of the particular kind of detailed affection that mothers are capable of even across enormous distances. Louisa wore the dark blue dress that she had worn to their first supper, because she did not own a white wedding dress and saw no compelling reason to acquire one, and she looked completely and exactly like herself, which was the most beautiful thing Bernard could imagine. They exchanged their vows in front of everyone they knew, and the light came through the church windows at the particular September angle that made everything gold. And when Reverend Galt pronounced them married and Bernard kissed her, the sound from the pews was entirely satisfying. They celebrated at Grace Haverson's establishment afterward, which Grace had decorated for the occasion and which felt, for one golden September afternoon, like the exact center of the world. Louisa moved her things from the Drummond bunkhouse to Bernard's cabin on the Harker land, their land now, both of them, and the transition was immediate and easy and natural, the way she had known it would be. She was not a person who required adjustment periods. She arrived at a new situation and assessed it and integrated herself into it with the same directness she brought to everything. And the cabin received her the way the land had always seemed to receive her, like she was supposed to be there, like the place had been waiting. She worked her last 2 weeks at Drummond's as she had promised, and on her final day Cutter presented her with a length of good rope, braided, the kind of work he was famous for, and said that it was practical and she should take it. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." "I did not do anything," he said. "You did," she said. He went back to work and she rode Creek home to her husband. That winter, the winter of 1881 going into 1882, was the first winter Louisa had spent indoors with someone since her parents, and she found that it suited her. Not in the sense of softening her, not in the sense of making her smaller, but in the sense of giving her a different kind of richness evenings by the fire with Bernard reading opposite her. The sound of the wind outside and the warmth within, the particular pleasure of working land with someone who cared about it as much as she did and thought about it differently enough that combining their thinking produced better results than either would have reached alone. They argued about cattle management with continued enthusiasm. They disagreed about the best approach to the western section drainage, and each built their case with specific evidence. And the argument lasted 3 days and was resolved by implementing a combination of both approaches, which worked better than either pure approach would have, which neither of them pointed out to the other because it was too obvious and too satisfying. Bernard expanded the herd to 30 head by spring 1882, using a careful combination of purchase and a lease arrangement he had negotiated with Old Man Harker's son for additional grazing rights along the Chicaskia. Louisa managed the daily operation with a precision and efficiency that freed Bernard to handle the business side, the negotiations, the market timing, the relationship with the cattle buyers who came up from the south and east. They had divided the work not by any convention but by straightforward assessment of who was better at what, which was a conversation they had had practically and without any drama. Spring 1882 brought with it something new. Louisa had suspected for about 6 weeks and had confirmed it quietly with Dr. Ellison on a Tuesday morning in April, and she came home in the early afternoon and found Bernard mending fence on the south side of the property, and she rode up to him and dismounted. "I need to tell you something," she said. He set down the fence tool. He looked at her, at the particular quality of her stillness, which was different from her usual stillness, which had something inside it that he could not quite name, but which made his heart begin to move with an urgency he could not explain. "We are going to have a baby," she said. Bernard Rhodes stood in the spring sunshine and felt the world reorganize itself around this single fact. And then he crossed the 3 steps between them and put his arms around her, pulling her against him, and she put her arms around him too, and they stood in the warm April air holding each other with the full weight of the news pressing into both of them, and it was enormous and good. "Are you all right?" he said into her hair. "I am very all right," she said. "I am better than all right." He pulled back enough to look at her face. Her eyes were bright and certain, the amber dark in the full spring light. "How do you feel?" he said. "Like everything has just become considerably more serious and also considerably more wonderful simultaneously," she said, "which is uncomfortable and completely correct." He laughed and kissed her, and she pushed him back gently and said, "Now get back to the fence because that section is not going to hold through summer if you leave it." He went back to the fence, but he spent the rest of the afternoon not quite able to stop smiling. The pregnancy was not easy. Louisa was ill in the first months in a way that was practically infuriating to her, a woman who prided herself on her physical capability, and she managed it the way she managed all things, by acknowledging it, adapting around it, and refusing to be diminished by it. She continued working, though she adjusted what she took on and how she went about things, and she was honest with Bernard about how she was feeling, which was something she had to work at because her instinct was always to say she was fine. "Tell me when it is hard," he had said early on. "It is always hard," she had said. "That is not news." "Tell me specifically when," he said. She thought about it. "The mornings are difficult," she admitted. "The evenings are better. Then in the evenings we will do whatever is useful," he said, "and in the mornings I will handle what can be handled and you will not argue with me about it." "I will absolutely argue with you about it," she said. "You will argue," he agreed, "and then let me do it anyway." She had, in fact, done exactly that. Dr. Ellison monitored the pregnancy with the methodical attentiveness that made him excellent at his job, and he gave Louisa the full weight of his professional information, which she received gratefully, because she wanted information rather than reassurance. He told her what to expect at each stage, what was normal and what would warrant concern, and she filed all of it away with the same precision she brought to any practical subject. The summer of 1882 passed in heat and work, and the particular sweet difficulty of those months, and Bernard was present for all of it in a way that she did not know how to fully express but felt completely. He never treated her as fragile. He had understood from the beginning that treating her as fragile would be both inaccurate and insulting, but he was simply there, consistently, with the same steady attention he had always brought to her. Their son was born in November 1882. He arrived on a Wednesday evening after a labor that lasted most of the day, with Dr. Ellison present, and everything as managed as such an unmanageable thing could be. And when it was done, and Louisa was exhausted and certain and lying in the bed with the baby on her chest, Bernard sat in the chair next to her with his elbows on his knees, and his hands folded, and looked at the two of them with an expression that was too large for his face to quite contain. "He is very small," he said. "All babies are small," Louisa said, her voice ragged from the hours of effort. "He looks like you," he said. She looked down at the baby's small red face, dark wisps of hair, the absolute improbable perfection of a new person. "He looks like a baby," she said. "He does not look like anyone yet." "He has your forehead," Bernard said. She looked at him, and there were tears in his eyes, which she had never seen before, and the sight of it did something to her that nothing else had ever done, cracked something open right in the center of her, some last remaining held thing, and she felt completely and absolutely present in a way that made all her previous experiences of presence seem partial. "Come here," she said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby close, and she took his hand and pressed it to the small, warm weight of their son. "George," she said, after her father. She had decided this 3 months ago and had told Bernard then, and he had said, immediately and without qualification, that it was exactly right. "George," he said. They named him George Henry Rhodes Henry for Bernard's father, and they brought him home to the cabin on the Chicaskia. And Caldwell greeted the news with the warm enthusiasm of a community that had been watching this particular story unfold for 2 years, and was satisfied with where it had arrived. Cutter came to see the baby and held him with the practiced ease of a man who had been around livestock his whole life and understood the basic principles of small, fragile things requiring careful handling. He looked at George for a long moment and said, "He has the Bristol look about the eyes." "Everyone keeps saying something," Louisa said from the chair. "It is because it is obvious," Cutter said. He handed George back and stood up and said, "You have done well, Louisa Bristol." "Rhodes," she said. "You have done well, Louisa Rhodes," he said, and there was something in his voice that made it more than a name correction, made it a kind of blessing, and she took it as that. The years that followed were full and good, and not without difficulty, because the kind of life they were building did not offer the option of difficulty-free. But the difficulty was the sort that comes from things being real and serious and worth caring about. And so, it had a different quality than hardship for its own sake. By 1885, the Rhodes Ranch had grown to 65 head of cattle, and the cabin had been expanded. Bernard had built 2 additional rooms, one of which became George's room, and one of which Louisa had claimed as an office space for the records and planning work she had taken on as their operation became more complex. The drainage on the western section worked excellently, as the combined approach had predicted it would, and they had fenced and improved and developed the land into something that was genuinely productive and properly theirs. George at 3 was an extraordinarily energetic small person who had his mother's directness and his father's patience in a combination that was occasionally alarming and usually excellent. He wanted to know everything about the horses and the cattle and the fence lines and the quality of the grass, and he asked questions in rapid succession and was not satisfied by vague answers, which both his parents found intensely amusing and very recognizable. In 1884, Cecil Drummond died of a heart ailment, not unexpectedly, given that he had been in poor health for some months. Cutter, who was the only hand who had been with Drummond long enough to have that kind of standing, sent word to Louisa when it happened. She rode over and helped organize the practical matters alongside Drummond's son, who had come down from Wichita and was not particularly familiar with how the operation ran but was sensible enough to take guidance. Cutter, at 62, and with the kind of accumulated soreness that came from 40 years of hard physical work, was ready to retire from full-time ranch work. He came to the Rhodes property for supper one evening that fall and sat at their table and ate Louisa's cornbread and talked about what he was thinking, which was to stay in Caldwell in a small house near the stockyards and do occasional work as it suited him. "We could use help," Louisa said. "Not the same as before, but we are growing, and another set of good hands when you want the work would not go amiss." He looked at her. "You are offering me occasional work on my own terms." "I am," she said. He looked at Bernard. Bernard put his hands around his coffee cup and said, "You would not be beholden to any schedule, just whenever it works and is useful." Cutter nodded slowly, in the way of a man who had been offered something he actually wanted, but was taking a moment to accept gracefully. "That would suit me," he said. Tommy, who had left the Drummond spread the previous year to take up land of his own 20 miles east, he was 22 now, had grown into a capable and steady young man with plans of his own, still rode by when he was in Caldwell. He called the Rhodes property the nicest kept spread in the county, which was the kind of straightforward compliment that was all the more meaningful for being stated as simple fact. In 1886, Louisa was expecting again. The second pregnancy was easier in some ways and more complicated in others. She was 4 years older. The work of the ranch was more demanding as the operation had grown, and George at almost 4 was a fully committed force of nature who required continuous management. But she was also more experienced, and Bernard was more experienced, and they navigated it with the competence that comes from having done a hard thing together before. Their daughter was born in February 1887, in the coldest month of what was proving to be a hard winter. She arrived with less drama than George had, as if she had observed the situation and decided to be practical about it, and she was small and dark-haired and had Bernard's eyes, that steady, seeing quality, taking in the world with a calm attention that seemed to predate her by years. They named her Clara Ann Rhodes, Clara for Louisa's mother and Anne for Bernard's grandmother. Louisa held her in the fire-lit bedroom with the winter wind outside and the house warm against it, and she thought of her own mother with a clarity and a sweetness that was the particular quality of grief that has had years to become something else, not gone, but transformed, carrying love forward into the present. "She is going to be interesting," Louisa said. "All your children are going to be interesting," Bernard said. "It is structurally inevitable. You contribute to this as well," she said. "I contribute the patience," he said. "Everything interesting comes from you." She reached out and took his hand, and he sat with her in the firelight, the two of them and their new daughter, while George slept in the next room with the complete abandonment of a 4-year-old who did not know what had happened and would be extremely interested in the morning. The morning came, and George stood in the doorway of the bedroom with his dark hair sticking up from sleep and looked at the small wrapped bundle in his mother's arms with the expression of a person processing new information at speed. "That is the baby," he said. "That is your sister," Louisa said. "Her name is Clara." George walked over and looked at Clara very seriously. Clara looked back at him with her New World eyes, that calm taking in. "She is very small," he said. "You were smaller," Bernard said from the chair. George appeared to find this implausible. "I was not," he said. "You were," Louisa said. "You were this small. Everyone is at first." George considered Clara for another moment, then said, "I can show her the horses when she is bigger." "She would like that," Louisa said. He went for breakfast, thoroughly satisfied with the arrangement, and Louisa looked at Bernard and they both laughed quietly, in the way that people laugh when something is both funny and deeply tender. Caldwell in 1887 was still a working cattle town, though the trail drive era was beginning its slow change as the railroad expanded and the routes shifted. The Rhodes Ranch had established itself firmly enough within the regional cattle trade to weather the changes better than less established operations. Bernard had been watching the economic shifts with the same forward attention he brought to everything, and had been diversifying their approach for the past 2 years, adding some grain production and building relationships with the local market that reduced their dependence on the long-trail buyers. They had hired 2 full-time hands by this point, a quiet, reliable man named Ezra who had come up from Texas and had never given anyone a moment of trouble in 3 years, and a young woman named Me who had arrived looking for work the previous spring with a letter of reference in her pocket and the Louisa Bristol directness about her, and Louisa had hired her before she finished reading the letter. Bernard had watched the scene and said nothing, having learned that Louisa's instincts about people were essentially infallible. Me was 20 and excellent with horses, and had a fierce, bright intelligence that she was still learning to fully believe in. Louisa mentored her with the same directness and specificity that characterized everything she did, and Me absorbed it with the hunger of someone who had not previously encountered a woman in this kind of role, and found the reality of it transformative. Ezra, who was privately somewhat old-fashioned in his ideas about the world, watched Louisa and Me operate for about 2 months, and then revised his views with the pragmatic adaptability of someone who respects demonstrated competence. And after that, they all worked together without issue. Cutter came by in his occasional capacity throughout 1887 and into 1888, and he taught George to braid rope with the patient thoroughness of a master craftsman who had found an eager student. and George took to it with the focused intensity he brought to anything he was interested in. Clara, who was a crawler of impressive determination by the fall of 1887 and a walker by spring 1888, began following Ezra around the yard in the manner of a small person who has decided that a particular large person is interesting, and Ezra took this with the grave dignity of a man honored by the appointment. The years stacked themselves, good and full. In 1889, Kansas became more formally settled in ways that changed the character of the territory. The open-range era was genuinely ending. The fencing that Bernard had started years ago was now something every operation was doing. The land was being claimed and organized in ways that made the wildness of the earlier decades feel like another country entirely. Louisa, who had arrived in Caldwell when it was still genuinely a frontier town, felt the change with a kind of rueful recognition. She did not mourn the hard parts that were ending, but she held onto the particular quality of the openness, the sense that the land was capable of being whatever you were willing to make of it, as something worth remembering. George at 7 was already helping with real work, not the figurehead work that adults sometimes give children to feel included, but actual tasks that required his attention and capability. He understood the horses better than most adults twice his age, which was entirely predictable given his upbringing. Clara at 2 was beginning to speak with the careful precision of someone who has been listening very hard and is now deploying what she has gathered, and she spoke to the horses and the cattle and Ezra and me and her father, and particularly to her mother in the same direct, interested tone, as if she found all of them equally fascinating. Bernard watched his daughter one afternoon standing at the fence watching the cattle with her arms propped on the lowest rail, completely absorbed, and he thought, that is Louisa, exactly in miniature at the beginning of everything. He told Louisa this that evening, and she looked at him with a complicated expression that was partly flattered and partly something more moved than she would easily admit. She is going to be something, Louisa said. She already is something, Bernard said. You know what I mean. I know exactly what you mean, he said, and I agree. They sat on the porch that evening after the children were in bed, the 1889 Kansas evening going through its spectacular paces overhead, the stars emerging one by one over the dark land, and Bernard put his arm around Louisa and she leaned against him with the ease of many years of learning each other's weight. I want to tell you something, she said. All right, he said, which was what he always said because he was always ready. I have been thinking about the early days, she said, Benton Creek and leaving and the years before I came to Caldwell, and I think I have thought this before, but I want to say it now that everything I was building in those years, even when I could not see it, was pointing toward this. He was quiet, listening. Not you specifically, she said, because I did not know you existed, but the direction of it. The kind of life I wanted without being able to name it. I think I always wanted something real and permanent and jointly held, something that I had built with someone who saw me as I actually am. I see you as you actually are, he said. I know, she said. That is the point. He pulled her closer and she let him, and they sat in the dark with the stars above them and the land around them and the house behind them with their children sleeping in it, and the full weight of their life together was present in that moment in the way that only quiet can carry. The following spring, 1890, brought with it the kind of turning that comes from accumulation. Bernard had been in conversation for several months with the cattle association that served the southern Kansas region, and he had been asked to take a position on their managing board, a role that would involve more deliberate planning and negotiation work and less of the daily physical ranch labor, though he would not abandon the operation itself. He talked to Louisa about it at length before accepting, because that was how they did things. It is the right move, she said, after hearing everything. The direction the industry is going, having someone on that board who actually understands how ranches work rather than just how money moves, that is useful. It will take time I currently spend here, he said. I can handle here, she said. I have been handling here. "We have been handling here," he said. She smiled. "We have been handling here," she agreed. "And we will continue to. You take the board position." He did, and it opened up a different chapter of their life together. One where he was frequently in meetings in Caldwell or traveling to Wichita for association business. And she ran the ranch with Ezra and me, and the occasional Cutter and George, now 8, as a genuine working participant. The ranch was 65 head of cattle and some grain, and a reputation in the region as being extremely well operated, and visitors who came by sometimes asked to speak to the rancher, and were slightly surprised to find that the rancher in question was a woman who was happy to answer their questions with complete precision. She did not find this surprising. She had stopped being surprised by this particular surprise a long time ago. In 1890, a drought came through south-central Kansas that was difficult for everyone who worked the land. The spring rains did not arrive with their usual thoroughness, and by July the grass was under stress, and the creek levels had dropped, and Bernard was spending considerable time in association meetings trying to coordinate a regional response that would prevent the kind of catastrophic individual losses that could destroy smaller operations. Louisa managed the ranch through it with the focused adaptability of someone who had been reading weather and land for 20 years. She reduced the herd load on the most stressed sections, arranged water access from a deeper point on the Chicaskia that held water better in dry years, and planted a smaller but more sustainable grain crop that was more drought-tolerant. She lost some cattle to the summer heat, not many, but some, and she felt each loss as the real cost it was, without dramatizing it. Bernard came home from a particularly frustrating association meeting one August evening and found her in the yard with me, reviewing the water situation at the south tank, and he came out to join her after putting his horse up. She looked at him when he arrived at the tired line of his shoulders at the dust of the road on him. "Sit down," she said, which was her version of asking how he was. He sat on the water trough edge. She came and stood beside him and put her hand on the back of his neck, and he leaned his head briefly against her side. "The Cartwright operation is going to lose everything," he said, his voice muffled. "The association can help with some emergency credit, but it will not be enough." "I know," she said. She ran her hand slowly across his shoulders. "You cannot save everyone." "I can save more than we are saving," he said. "Then figure out how and do it," she said. "But not tonight." He looked up at her. "Tonight you are going to eat supper and see your children and sleep," she said. "Tomorrow you will have the capacity to figure out what can be done." He put his hand over hers where it rested on his shoulder. "When did you get so sensible?" he said. "I have always been sensible," she said. "You have just been tired enough to notice." He stood up and she took his hand and they walked back to the house together. And George met them at the porch door to report on the progress of a construction project he had been building with Cutter's rope offcuts. And Clara appeared behind him wanting to be picked up. And Bernard picked her up, and she settled against his chest with the complete trust of a small person who has never had reason to doubt their welcome. And the August evening held them all in its hot, dry breath, and it was still, in the midst of difficulty, unmistakably good. The drought broke in the fall with heavy October rains that came with more force than anyone asked for, but which everyone accepted with the gratitude of people who had been waiting. The land began to recover, and the Cartwright family, through a combination of association assistance and the kind of regional neighborliness that made a community an actual community rather than just a collection of adjacent individuals, managed to hold on, and by the following spring they were rebuilding. Bernard spent 1891 on the board, continuing the work he had started, building a more structured regional support network that could respond more effectively to drought and other land crises, which felt like something worth doing beyond the immediate scale of their own operation. Louisa watched him do this work with the particular respect she had always had for people who applied real intelligence to real problems, and she told him so plainly, which she had learned was something he needed to hear from her even though he did not ask for it. "You are good at this," she said one evening when he had come home from a successful meeting that had resulted in a concrete agreement among 6 area ranchers to share water access in drought conditions. "It is negotiation," he said. "I have been doing negotiation in various forms since I started here." "It is more than that," she said. "You make people feel like their interest and the collective interest are the same thing. That is not easy." He looked at her. "Is that a compliment?" "I can never quite tell with you because they arrive wrapped in analysis." "They arrive wrapped in analysis because you deserve the specific reason, not just the general approval," she said. He laughed, and she smiled, and it was still, after a decade of knowing each other and nearly a decade of marriage, the most natural thing either of them could do. George at 9 was beginning to talk about what he wanted to do with his life in the way that children do when they are old enough to project themselves into the future, and what he wanted, consistently and articulately, was to work the land. Not just their land specifically, though he loved it. He had the broader ambition of his mother and the structured thinking of his father, and he talked about expanding, about what the region could become if people managed it right, about the quality of the grass and the water and what it could support. Bernard and Louisa listened to him with the pleasure of parents who have raised a child to think and found that the child can, in fact, think. Clara at 4 was interested in everything with equal intensity, which meant she had rotating obsessions. The horses for 3 weeks, then the specific mechanics of how the water pump worked, then the patterns in the rope braiding that Cutter had been teaching her. She had taught herself to read from the books that Louisa kept in the house with a determination that had bypassed the usual teaching process, simply absorbing letters and words by watching and asking and figuring out, until one day she arrived at breakfast and read the entirety of the label on the flour tin and looked very pleased with herself. Louisa had looked at Bernard. Bernard had looked at Louisa. "That is your forehead again," he said. "That is your patience," she said. "The way she just worked at it until it opened up." "Hours then," he said. "Hours," she agreed. In 1892, Cutter died peacefully in his small house near the Caldwell stockyards. He was 69 and he had been declining slowly for a year, and it was the kind of death that comes at the end of a full life lived on one's own terms, which was the only kind Cutter would have accepted. Louisa rode to Caldwell when she heard and spent the afternoon with a few of the old hands who had come to pay their respects, and she said everything about him that was true, that he was the best rope man she had ever known, that he had been kind to her when it would have been easier not to be, that the world was smaller without him in it. She brought George, who was 10. He stood quietly through it all and on the ride home said, "He was the one who taught me the braiding." "Yes," she said. "I am going to keep doing it," George said, "so it stays." She looked at her son riding beside her on the October road and thought of all the things that stay, the skills, the kindness, the ways that people persist in the people they have touched. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly right." They rode home in the fall afternoon, and the Rhodes ranch was there waiting for them, solid and permanent and warm. The spring of 1893 brought a new development. Me, who had been with them for 6 years now, had married the previous fall. A man named Harris who worked a spread 15 miles west. A solid, decent man who had been clearly and patiently interested in me for 2 years before she noticed in a way she acted on. The wedding had been at the Caldwell church, and Louisa and Bernard had attended and given them good household items from the general store as a gift. And me had cried a little and then been immediately embarrassed about it. And Louisa had told her that the embarrassment was unnecessary. That honest feeling was not a weakness. Me continued working at the Rhodes ranch even after marrying, which her husband supported without issue because Me's income mattered and her capability was something he took genuine pride in. And this arrangement lasted until the spring of 1893, when Me arrived one morning to tell them she was going to have a baby and would need to step back from the full-time work. Louisa received this with the complete warmth it deserved, and also immediately began thinking practically about how to reconfigure the labor situation, which me had expected and found comforting rather than cold. They hired a new hand, a man named Davis, 25, from Illinois, who had worked cattle for 2 seasons in Texas and had the references and the actual skills to prove it. He integrated quickly and well, and me, in her reduced but continuing capacity, took on oversight of the grain accounts, which freed Louisa for the larger operational management. George at 11 was doing work that a seasoned ranch hand would be proud of. Bernard had started bringing him to association meetings when it seemed appropriate, letting him sit and listen to the conversations about land and water and cattle markets, and George absorbed it all with the same focus he brought to the rope braiding, meticulously, with genuine interest, filing everything in some internal organizational system that would be useful later. Clara at 6 was reading everything she could get her hands on, which in Caldwell in 1893 was not as much as she wanted. Louisa had been ordering books through the general store for 2 years, history, some science, novels that had been recommended by the Wichita librarian, who corresponded with people in the region about reading materials, and Clara moved through them with an appetite that was wonderful and occasionally overwhelming. Bernard, watching his daughter one evening absorbed in a history of the Western Territories, sitting cross-legged on the floor in the lamplight with the book tilted toward the fire for better light, said quietly to Louisa, "She is going to go further than this." "I know," Louisa said. "We will have to think about schooling." "There is talk of a proper school in Caldwell next year," he said. "Not enough," she said. "Later, I mean, further along." He looked at her understanding. "You are already thinking about this." "I have been thinking about it since she read The Flower Tin," Louisa said. "I just need to think about it longer before I know what the right approach is." "We will figure it out," he said. "We usually do," she said. It was not boastfulness. It was the statement of people who had accumulated enough evidence to have genuine confidence in their collaborative capacity. The school in Caldwell did open in 1894, and George and Clara both attended, and the teacher, a measured and intelligent woman named Miss Paulson who had come from Kansas City for the position, recognized within her first week that the Rhodes children were going to make her work both more challenging and considerably more rewarding. She wrote to their parents after a month to say so, and Louisa wrote back with the directness that had always characterized her correspondence. They had both been raised to think carefully about things and to say what they actually meant, she explained, and she hoped that was more helpful than troublesome in a classroom context. Miss Paulson, who was 30 and sharp and had a sense of humor she kept professional, kept that letter for a long time. In 1895, the ranch had grown to 80 head and 2 sections of quality grain production, and Bernard's work on the association board had resulted in concrete improvements to the regional water management system that had demonstrably helped smaller operations survive the previous 2 dry seasons. He was well respected in Caldwell and in the broader county in the specific way that comes from having actually done useful things rather than simply having influence, and he carried this with the same undemonstrative quality that characterized everything about him. Louisa at 37 was still the most capable person most people in Caldwell had encountered, and she was also something else, something that age and settled life and love well lived had added to the wildfire quality that had always been there. She was warmer, not in the sense of having softened, but in the sense of having more to give because she was not spending any of herself on survival alone. She had George and Clara and Bernard and the land and the community, and she had built all of it from a 21-year-old with a saddlebag and a letter of reference and an absolute refusal to be anyone other than herself. She thought about this sometimes, in the particular quiet way that certain thoughts arrive when you are doing something physical and repetitive, riding fence, hauling water, the morning tasks that leave the mind partially free. She thought about what her mother would have said and her father. She thought they would have been pleased, which was not a small thing. The fall of 1895 was gold and crisp and abundant, the harvest coming in well and the herd healthy, and the community of Caldwell going about its life with the particular energy of a place that has survived enough difficulty to take its prosperity seriously. On a Saturday in October, which was an anniversary of sorts, the anniversary of that first fence line meeting, 15 years ago almost to the month, Bernard saddled 2 horses and told Louisa to leave the morning work to Davis and Ezra and come with him. She raised an eyebrow. "Where are we going?" "The eastern edge," he said. She knew the eastern edge. The creek, the thick grass, the view. She had known what he was doing since he said leave the work to Davis and Ezra, but she let him do it anyway, which was its own kind of grace. They rode out in the October morning, the same gold and blue that Kansas produced in fall as reliably as anything, and they dismounted at the creek and stood in the grass where they had stood 16 years ago. He had proposed here, and she had said yes, and the ground still held that, the way good ground holds what has happened in it. He stood beside her and they looked out across the land. Their land. Everything they could see. "I want to say something," he said. "You have been saying things very well for 15 years, she said. "I trust you to continue." He turned to look at her, his wife, the mother of his children, his partner in all of it, the woman who had told a stranger at a fence line about soil quality with the conviction of someone who loved the thing they were talking about and had thereby altered the direction of his life entirely. "I am grateful," he said. "I want to say that plainly without complication. I am grateful for this life and for you, and I know it is not a small thing to have been lucky enough to build something real with someone who is," he paused, finding the word, "who is genuinely themselves. You have never been anything other than who you are, and living with that with you has made me more myself as well." That is what I wanted to say. She looked at him for a long time. The October wind moved through the grass around them. The horses grazed behind them with their unhurried contentment. "You are the only person," she said, "who has ever made me want to stay somewhere, not because you kept me, but because you gave me something worth staying for." He reached for her hand. She gave it. They stood in the October morning on the land they had built together, and it was the closest thing to perfect that either of them would ever hold. Not because everything was easy or had always been good, but because everything was real, everything was earned, and everything was shared. George and Clara were waiting when they rode back, George at the fence watching the horizon the way his mother always had, which made Bernard's chest ache with love, and Clara on the porch with a book she had abandoned in favor of watching for them, because she always wanted to know where her parents were, which she would deny being sentimental about for the rest of her life. Supper that evening was the full table. Ezra and Davis were invited in as they sometimes were. Me and Harris had come over for the occasion, and Miss Paulson had been prevailed upon by Clara to join them, which she had accepted with the grace of someone who understood what family dinners actually are. The table was full and loud, and the conversation went in 6 directions at once, and the cornbread was very good, and the fire was warm, and the October dark was comfortable against the windows, and Bernard sat at the end of the table and looked at the length of it, all of them, and caught Louisa's eye across the noise and the lamplight. She was already looking at him. She was always looking at him. She raised her glass water, plain water in a tin cup, and he raised his, and they held each other's gaze in that specific way that carries everything, and did not need to say what the toast was for because it was for all of it, every bit, from the fence line in October to this evening, and every evening to come. George noticed the exchange the way children notice what their parents are to each other when they are old enough to see it clearly, and he went back to his supper with the particular private satisfaction of a person who has grown up inside something good and knows it. Clara, who noticed everything and filed it for later, looked at her parents looking at each other and thought, in the clear, direct way of her mother, that is what it is supposed to look like. That is the thing worth having. She turned back to her conversation with Miss Paulson about the book she had been reading, and the table was warm, and outside the October dark lay over the Kansas land like something patient and immense, and full of everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. The life they had built held together in the lamplight, complete and unfinished both at once, unfinished because life is, because there were more years ahead with all their variety and color, because George would eventually take the land and make it his own in ways they had not yet imagined, and Clara would go further, as Louisa had known she would, and come back to them changed and enriched, but complete in the way that mattered, in the sense of being real and whole and genuinely theirs, built by two people who had met at a fence line and found in each other something that fire finds when it finds something that doesn't try to put it out but simply burns alongside it, steady and warm and exactly what it is. That was Louisa Bristol. That was Bernard Rhodes. That was the life that two people can build when one of them is brave enough to tell the truth and the other is wise enough to hear it, and both of them are willing to work. The October wind found the old farmhouse and moved around it, the way wind does, and inside the light held and would hold for a long time yet.